Ideas, the show where we look at misfires, mistakes, and miscalculations from all throughout history.
I'm Tony Southcott.
And I'm Albert Berg, and the bad idea that we're talking about today is one that is, I would say, somewhat close to our heart here at Human Echoes, Tony. We're fans of weird-shaped Earth theories, casual fans, I would say, of the people who are interested in the flat Earth, mostly. But today we're going to be talking about a different theory about the shape of the Earth, the hollow Earth.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't so much change the shape as much as completely take out the core.
Yeah, and it's telling to those of you flat earthers out there that even as far back as 1618, Kepler was the first one to introduce this theory. He knew the Earth was round, at least. He understood that much about science, to know the Earth was round. It might be hollow on the inside, he said, but it's for definitely round.
And Kepler's the one that they named the Kepler Space Telescope afterward. So, like...
Yes. He is the original one who came up with the idea of the orbit of the planets. The fact that the planets went around the sun, and he had the idea that there were these rings that were sort of perfectly nested within each other throughout the solar system, and his mind, sort of naturally, as human minds do, trying to form a pattern, said, well, if these nested rings are a fact of life in the outer solar system, what if that pattern continues inward? What if we have a nested series of spheres, and that's what the planets are made out of? And the people piled on top of him and said, oh, hey, you know what? Maybe that ring of Saturn that we can see is like one of those spheres that exploded, and like this is the fragments that are left behind. Edmund Halley jumped on board the Hollow Earth train in 1692, and he thought that possibly a hollow Earth would be able to explain some interesting magnetic fluctuations that he was seeing. And it's been attributed also, this idea, to a mathematician named Leonard Euler, I believe, most famous for Euler's number. However, he, upon further research, was not a proponent of the theory. He just used it as a thought experiment and said, hey, imagine a hollow Earth, and then we draw a line inside of it or something. He was not actually proposing that the Earth was hollow.
Yeah, that sounds like a thought experiment I'd have if I was drinking pretty hard.
Well, you haven't invented Euler's number now, Tony, so...
Maybe if I drank hard enough, I could come up with Southcott's number.
But the specific form of the hollow Earth theory that we're going to be talking about today was the one that was proposed by a man named John Cleves Symmes Jr. John Cleves Symmes Jr. is the author of The Theory of Concentric Spheres, and he was born in New Jersey on November 5th, 1780. He was, obviously this is before America is a country, but he's on the cusp of it. The original John Cleves Symmes was not his father, but his uncle, who was a major Revolutionary War hero. And John Cleves Symmes Jr. followed in his uncle's steps, signed up for the military, ended up fighting in the War of 1812. I say fighting, most of the fighting he did was with a fellow surgeon who accused him of like doing some weird stuff with some sick hours, and he got into a duel. But he served. He was an important part. He obviously a patriot, loved his country. After the war, he went into business for himself. He tried to start up a trading outpost to supply the U.S. military and also American Indians out on the frontier. He married a widow who had like 10 kids. And
that is taking on some responsibility.
You might think that this is the beginning of the evidence that he's not the brightest bulb in the shed. I will also want to say, before we dig into the specifics, some of the ways I read his accounts, his personal account of this duel that he conducted with this other surgeon, and I suspect, and I'm not a psychiatrist, and if I was, I don't have John Cleves Symmes Jr. here to diagnose personally, so take all this with a grain of salt. I suspect if John Cleves Symmes Jr. was alive today, we would think of him as somebody possibly being on the autism spectrum. He's just not... The way he's talking about interacting with other people just doesn't quite jive with how you think a normal person would interact, even forgetting all the social norms that have changed back then. I may be reading too much into that.
Oh, the social norms back then, you had to be a lot more polite, otherwise you're going to get into duels over stupid little things.
Although he was the one who was slighted, I would say. He was the one who had been impolited too. And at some point in his life, and we don't know for sure, but Symmes gets this idea that the Earth is hollow. This is not a super widely propagated idea at the time, okay? We think he may have gotten it from reading this book called The Christian Philosopher, which was the first systematic book of science ever published in America. And there is a mention of this idea that the Earth might be hollow in this book. And you can sort of imagine Symmes out on the frontier reading this book and sort of building up this idea in his mind. And he thought that it explained a lot about the natural world. He had all these theories about the migration of birds and other animals that he thought they were migrating to the inner side of this sphere. He thought that it could explain the currents of the ocean, that the ocean was flowing into one pole and out of the other pole of the sphere. He even believed that, and I can cut him some slack for some of this because you're talking about very limited information. He thought the aurora borealis was an artifact of the sunlight coming in the tilted side of the Earth on one side of the sphere and being projected out the other side. And while that doesn't fit our image of the aurora borealis today, we've seen pictures of it at the very least. If you're just hearing a guy describe lights in the sky, you might make that fit in with your kooky theory about the hollow Earth.
Yeah, but wouldn't there be chasms for it to be projected through? Would people be able to find those?
Well, this is Symmes' dream, Tony. He thinks that yes, there are massive chasms. There are these huge holes at both poles, and these became known as Symmes holes. And he wanted to go and explore these holes. He thought you could go into the inside of the Earth. He envisioned a future where there was trade with the people on the inside of the Earth, and he wrote this circular, this little tract that he paid to have printed up. And it said, "To all the world, I declare the Earth is hollow and habitable within, containing a number of solid concentric spheres, one within the other, and that it is open at the poles 12 or 16 degrees. I pledge my life in support of this truth, and I am ready to explore the hollow, if the world will support and aid me in the undertaking." And he printed up, I don't have an exact number, but I'm led to believe something like hundreds of these, and sent them to people in positions of prominent power, sent them to scientists in America, sent them over to scientists in Europe. He was like, "Listen up, guys. You scientists, you need to know about this new thing I declare. It's definitely true because I declared it. The world is hollow." And of course, you can imagine, Tony, the reaction to this was not positive. Even back then, even as far back as early 1800s, scientists were like, "No, it's not. It's really, I don't think it is, dude. I don't think you know this." It was derided almost universally and very locally as well. He said he was a local mathematician in Cincinnati and derided Symmes for having written a heap of learned rubbish. And this did not stop him.
Man, I would love to get a hold of one of those pamphlets and just frame it.
Yeah?
Just to have one. Because right now all we have is B.O.B. the rapper putting out a GoFundMe to prove the Earth is flat. We don't have cool pamphlets like that anymore.
Yeah, and he's not writing to the scientists. See, the thing about the difference here is this guy probably naively thought, I can convince a scientist. And he's writing letters to him. This is the equivalent of one of our Flat Earth YouTube channels we enjoy so much, writing to NASA and be like, no, guys, you don't understand. It's flat. He's he goes to them first. So just so I figured it out. It's flat, guys. And then he starts publishing on YouTube. And of course, there wasn't any YouTube, Tony. John Cleves Symmes Jr., if he was alive today, might have had a YouTube channel, but he did not live today. He lived back in the 1800s. And so the YouTube equivalent of the 1800s was going around and physically talking to people about your ideas.
It just sounds like a lot of work.
A lot of work, and think about the beauty of YouTube is that you can put your thing out there, and maybe you get the comments back, Tony, right? Maybe you get that backlash, but you don't have that face-to-face level of derision that you would get if you walked up to someone, invited them into a room and said, "I'm going to talk to you today about how the Earth is hollow."
It's just a hard sell.
On top of the fact that he has a crazy idea, he's also a real bad public speaker. I mean, real bad. He had no confidence. He stammered. He was described by one of his greatest supporters in this way. His voice is somewhat nasal, and he speaks hesitantly and with apparent labor. His manners are plain and remarkable for native simplicity. Captain Symmes' want of a classical education and philosophic attainments perhaps unfits him for the office of lecturer. So you're out in the boonies. You've got nothing else to do. You go to see John Cleves Symmes Jr., and he stammers through this sort of a half-concocted speech about how the Earth is hollow. And the thing is, A, because, the state of education is pretty lackluster back then, and B, just because he is out in the frontier and there isn't a lot else to do, he manages to convince a fair number of people. He starts this hype train for the hollow Earth. And again, there was backlash. It wasn't universal popularity, but there were some people who definitely bought into this. A Revolutionary War veteran, Moses Brooks, wrote this poem about Symmes. He said, "Has not Columbia one aspiring son, by whom the unfading laurel may be won? Yes! History's pen may yet ascribe the name of Symmes to grace her future scroll of fame." A fan club.
I just have no words for this.
So he puts out this idea, and almost really early on, again, I mentioned that it starts to catch. It becomes popular enough that in 1820, basically the same year he begins lecturing on this topic, someone writes a book under the pseudonym Captain Adam Seaborn, and it's called Simsonia, A Voyage of Discovery, and it details a sailor's trip within the hollow Earth. And that's not that bad, right? Like everybody makes stories up about everything that's popular these days. We have Facebook movies and, I don't know, whatever thing that you have that's popular, that somebody's going to make a movie about it in some way. So,
I mean, this idea has many a movie made by it, most of them by the Asylum.
True, with some Nazis to boot. So that's one thing. However, to make matters worse, it's not just fiction, and it's not just country bumpkins that are into this idea. In 1822, 1823, and 1824, Kentucky Senator Richard M. Johnson petitioned Congress to set aside money to fund Symmes's proposed expedition to the poles. Now, it didn't end up going anywhere. It was tabled all 3 times, but it was interesting enough that he was at least able to get his local senator to propose this idea to Congress. And he also had a supporter in John Quincy Adams, who became president in 1824. The circumstances of Adams's administrations were rather interesting. He did not win the popular vote by a long shot, but he kind of got put in by the establishment because they liked him better than all the other options. And back then, politics was a little bit less democratic. It was sort of a backroom deals thing, and he got in by technicality, let's say, and was not super well liked.
Is he the younger of the John Adams presidents?
Yes.
Okay.
And he, for whatever reason, decided in his already tumultuous political career, Tony, decides to put some weight behind this Symmes expedition. From his journals, there is this quote: "The theory itself has been so much ridiculed, and is in truth so visionary. It will, however, have no support in Congress. That day will come, but not yet, nor in my time. May it be my fortune and my praise to accelerate its approach."
I can think of a few presidents right now who might tweet out something like that towards some of these theories.
In 1825, he petitioned to join a Russian expedition that was being outfitted to go to the poles, but he wasn't able to go because of a lack of funds. And still, he pressed on, Tony. He was not deterred by all these people laughing at him. He didn't care what you thought. He was going to keep trying. And one of the people that he won over to his side was a man named Jeremiah Reynolds. And Reynolds said to John Cleves Symmes, "Listen, we're out here on the frontier. Things are, some people are listening, but realistically, this is a hard scrabble life. There's not a lot of people out here with a lot of money, And there's not just a lot of people out here, period. We need to spread this good news of the inner world. We got to go where the people's at. We got to go back east and talk in the cities. We got to give these lectures on a large scale. And you can imagine Symmes is under no delusions about his ability as a speaker. He doesn't think he's a great speaker. He's horrified to get up in front of these people every single day, but he believes in his idea enough to do it. And now this guy says, let's go where there's a bunch more people. It was not an easy decision for Symmes to make, to jump out east, but Reynolds pushed him, and Symmes saw the wisdom, quote unquote, of the idea, and so he went. And him and Reynolds ended up out sort of closer to Philadelphia area, traveling up and down the East Coast. And in September 1825, they set out on their speaking tour, and it isn't long before Symmes and Reynolds have a falling out. Reynolds believes in the hollow earth theory, but he catches on to the idea pretty quickly that people are much more interested in the idea of an expedition to the poles than they are in the actual idea that the earth is hollow. And so when he speaks, and him and Symmes are kind of doing a tag team, he basically omits the whole giant holes at the poles idea and just says, man, wouldn't it be cool if we had a polar expedition, you guys? That would be neat, right? And Symmes got upset about this. He said, listen, you're betraying the cause. We're here trying to tell this idea and you're trying to sugarcoat it. And him and Reynolds part ways. And you can imagine Reynolds is young at the time. He's 26. He's the charismatic one. He's the one with the most energy. He's the one that people were actually willing to turn out and listen to. And Symmes just does not do well. And he doesn't know it yet, but these are going to be the final years of his life. And he spends them trudging up and down the East Coast, talking to these crowds that are ridiculing him. And it just takes a toll on him emotionally and eventually physically. And he ends up really badly sick. He stays with a friend for almost a year with this sickness until he's finally able to drag himself home and makes it to Cincinnati just before dying on May 29th, 1829. And it's interesting that even on his deathbed, even as his final breath is slipping away, he is composing yet more tracts about the truth of the hollow earth. And he dies. He kills himself because of this crazy theory, Tony, practically speaking. I imagine he might have lived a little longer if he hadn't subjected himself to that level of physical and emotional exertion. But he dies at a relatively young age, and he has a relatively young family. On his gravestone, erected by his son, Americus Symmes, who was 17 at the time of his death, were the words, Captain John Cleves Symmes was a philosopher and the originator of the Symmes theory of concentric spheres and polar voids. He contended that the earth is hollow and habitable within.
Yeah, like if you look at his gravestone, it's actually like this weird donut sphere at the top. Like for his model of what the hollow earth looked like.
And John Cleves Symmes, despite the fact that he died, his idea does not die with him. His son, Americus Symmes, is only 17 when his dad dies, as I mentioned. And obviously, a lot of the struggle of supporting the family falls to him because he's the man of the house left. But he was the one that commissioned this gravestone in the 1840s. And the interesting thing is, this idea became popular throughout the 1800s, more so than it ever was in Symmes' lifetime. And people started taking credit for these ideas that Symmes had come up with. And Americus Symmes, at the age of 66, would republish his father's papers in 1878 and put them out so that his father would not have the credit of this great idea taken away from him. Perhaps, however, the biggest legacy that he had was through Reynolds, who went on throughout the country preaching Symmes' ideas. And not only did he manage to succeed where Symmes had failed in the area of charisma and convincing people that he was not completely crazy, but he actually physically was able to make an expedition toward the poles. It went sour a little bit when they got almost to Antarctica and the crew mutinied, but you can imagine in sort of this time in America, that makes you even more of an interesting character. And the fact that he survives this mutiny, lives like a year in Chile as a soldier at one point, and comes back, and now he's really a hot topic on the lecture circuit, and he's still preaching this idea of the hollow earth. And it's believed that while on the lecture circuit, these ideas that he's preaching reach the mind of a man that you definitely will have heard of, Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe, his first published story is a manuscript found in a bottle, and it's the story of a hollow earth that was discovered on this strange voyage. And his only novel, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, is the story of a man who meets the inhabitants of a hollow earth as he's shipwrecked. And this idea, perhaps because of Poe, became relatively popular late into the 1800s. And it was only really truly debunked when the explorers finally did make it to the poles and we got scientific proof that no, there were not giant holes left open, and this idea was exposed as the bad idea that many people in Symmes' day already knew that it was.
They didn't go to the poles, man. They just went where it was icy and took pictures. Or sketches.
Yeah, those pictures of the Earth from space are photoshopped, Tony.
Yes.
But that's it. That's the story mainly of John Cleves Symmes Jr. and the people that he influenced. It's fascinating to me to think about this guy living out his life that doesn't accomplish very much and really thinks that he's going to change the world with this scientific theory that he has. And to expend all of this energy and be so unsuccessful. To be so... And not only that, but this... To expend all of this energy in the service of an idea that was not correct. He was not in his elements. He did not enjoy speaking in front of people. That he put himself out so far in the service of an idea that was so wrong is just tragic to me.
It's just obsession, too. It's like, it's amazing that it could go that far.
Yeah, I wish that I had him, or I wish I had more of his information around, but I would like to have met the man. I feel like that he would have been an interesting person, maybe not to be around with 24/7, but just to have on hand. I think that he must have been quite the character. And I made the comparison to modern YouTube channels of today, talking about the flat earth and sort of crazy kooky scientific conspiracies. And I think that there are some very strong parallels. I think that John Cleves Symmes Jr. would have fit right in that age, but he wasn't in that age. So he had to stump around and ended up dying of pneumonia or something from his exposure and just complete wear down of the people rejecting his admittedly wrong idea. You can't blame the guys who thought it was dumb, but you still got to feel bad for this dude.
Definitely.
So that's it for this week on Bad Ideas. If you have bad ideas that you'd like us to cover, you can write into us at badideasshow@gmail.com, and we will consider adding them to the list. And we will see you guys next week with another bad idea.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.